An Open Letter to Open-Minded Progressives by Mencius Moldbug. Chapter 7. The Ugly Truth About Government. Published May 29th, 2008. In Chapter 6, dear open-minded progressive, we worked through a clean room redesign of government. The result had no resemblance to present institutions, and little resemblance to past ones. Should this surprise you? Do you expect history's fruits to be sweet? In this chapter, we'll look at what those fruits actually are. Perhaps you didn't spend your 11th grade civics class hanging out behind the goalpost smoking chiba. If you are still in the 11th grade civics class, it's much more exciting if you're stoned. Perhaps you even read the Times on a regular basis. The Times is even more awful when you're stoned. Perhaps you assume, by default, that the vast parade of facts poured into your head by this and other such reliable sources must constitute at least a basic understanding. You would be incorrect in this, and we have Mr. Machiavelli, who is to government as Isaac Newton is to physics, Barry Bonds is to baseball, and Albert Hofmann is to LSD, to tell us why. Quote, "He who desires or attempts to reform the government of a state and wishes to have it accepted and capable of maintaining itself to the satisfaction of everybody, must at least retain the semblance of the old forms, so that it may seem to the people that there has been no change in the institutions, even though in fact they are entirely different from the old ones. For the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances, as though they were realities, and are often even more influenced by the things that seem than by those that are." Unquote. So, for example, the Roman Principate, and even to some extent the Dominate, preserved the forms of the old republic. If Rome under Augustus had had a New York Times, it would have been full of the doings of the Senate and the consuls. The senators said this, the consuls did that, when in reality everything that mattered went through Augustus. If the entire Senate had fallen through a manhole in the Forum, nothing would have changed, except, of course, that the illusion of the Republic could no longer be maintained. The Romans even had a word for a monarch, the good old Latin rex. No Roman emperor, however dissolute, autocratic, or hubristic, ever adopted the title of king. Emperor is simply an anglicization of imperator, meaning commander, i.e. general. Often when the illusion ceases to delude anyone, it persists as a linguistic convention, especially on the tongues of officials. So in British official language, one still may speak as if the Queen were the absolute personal ruler of the UK, when in fact she has no power at all. No one is confused by this. It is just a quaint turn of speech. Still, it has its effect. Power is a shy beast. She flees the sound of her name. When we ask who rules the UK, we are not looking for the answer, the Queen. The Queen may rock, but everyone knows she doesn't rule. Parting this thin outer peel, we come to the word Parliament, with which most of us are satisfied. This is your official answer. The Queen holds nominal power. Parliament holds formal power. But does this tell us where the actual power is? Why should we expect it to? Since when has it ever? Power has all the usual reasons to hide. Power is delicious and everyone wants it. To bite into its crisp, sweet flesh, to lick its juices off your lips, this is more than pleasure. It is satisfaction. It is fulfillment. It is meaning. The love of a bird for a caterpillar is a tenuous and passing attachment next to the bond between a man and power. Of course, power, like the caterpillar, may have other defenses, poison-filled spines and the like, but why not start with camouflage? Why look like anything more than a stick or a leaf? Of course, as a progressive, you have all sorts of ideas about where power is hiding. It is in the hands of the corporations, the crooked politicians, the bankers, the military, the television preachers, and so on. It would be unfair to denigrate all of these perspectives as conspiracy theories, and it is also unfair to denigrate all conspiracy theories as false. Lenin, for instance, was a conspirator. So were Algier Hiss, Benedict Arnold, and Machiavelli himself. Nonetheless, the best place to hide is usually in plain sight. For example, Noam Chomsky once wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, which argues that corporations exercise power by controlling the mass media. The phrase is borrowed from Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, a book which every progressive will do well to read. Wiki has a fine summary. Quote, when properly utilized, the manufacture of consent, Lippmann argues, is useful and necessary for modern society because the common interests, the general concerns of all people, are not obvious in many cases and only become clear upon careful data collection and analysis, which most of the people are either uninterested in or incapable of doing. Most people, therefore, must have the world summarized for them by those who are well informed. Since Lippmann includes much of the political elite within the set of those incapable of properly understanding by themselves the complex, unseen environment in which the affairs of the modern state take place, he proposes having professionals, a specialized class, collect the analyzed data and present the conclusions to the decision makers. The decision makers then take decisions and use the art of persuasion to inform the public about the decisions and the circumstances surrounding them. Unquote. Who is Lippmann's specialized class? Is it Chomsky's corporate CEOs? Rupert Murdoch, perhaps? Au contraire, it is folks like Lippmann himself, journalists. Lippmann describes his analysis and persuasion agency, somewhat infelicitously, as an intelligence bureau. Thus we have two candidates for who is manufacturing consent. It could be the corporate executives to whom the journalists report, or it could be the journalists themselves in plain sight. Or, of course, both in the true Agatha Christie style. As political detectives, we may ask, which of these parties has the means, motive, and opportunity? But I am getting ahead of myself. Starting from the usual first principles, we are attempting to understand our system of government. What one word, dear progressive, best describes the modern Western system of government? You probably said democracy. If you got two words, you might say representative democracy. So our progressive scratch monkey, Mr. Strauss, explains the success of democracy in terms of its supposed advantage here. He actually comes surprisingly close to the truth, as we will see in a little bit. Words mean whatever we want them to mean. But if we interpret the phrase representative democracy to mean a political system in which power is held by the representatives of the people, as chosen in the democratic elections, the United States is a representative democracy in just the same sense that the Roman Empire was a republic, the United Kingdom is a kingdom, and the Chinese Communist Party is communist. In fact, dear progressive, you fear and loathe democracy. Moreover, you are right to do so. Representative democracy is a thoroughly despicable system of government. It is dangerous and impractical at best, criminal at worst, and you hate it like the poison it is. But you don't hate it under this name. You hate it under the name of politics. Think of the associations that the words political, partisan, politician, and so on produce in your mind. You say, George W. Bush politicized the Justice Department. And this is a brutal indictment. If you hated black people the way you hate politics, you might say George W. Bush Negroized the Justice Department, and the phrase would carry the same payload of contempt. Similarly, when you hear antonyms such as apolitical, nonpartisan, bipartisan, or even the new and truly ludicrous post-partisan, your heart thrills with warmth and affection, just as it would if you were a racist and you heard the words Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, or Amelanistic, and as it does when you hear the word democracy. You certainly would never say that George W. Bush democratized the Justice Department, and yet, when you hear the phrase apolitical democracy, it sounds slightly off. Can we have democracy without politics? Representative democracy without politics? What would that even mean? That there are no parties, perhaps? So let me get this straight. 2 parties is good, 1 party is bad, very bad. No parties at all is even better? Wiki has such a curious page for nonpartisan democracy, in which some of these issues are explored in the typical disjointed and unenlightened manner. This is simply one of these contradictions that we may find in the modern progressive mind. You have probably wondered idly about it yourself. Since, as we've seen, progressivism is an essentially religious movement, the mystery of politics, that necessary evil of democracy, slides neatly into the same lobe of your brain that was in less enlightened days, reserved for the great questions of theology. How can God be 3 persons at once? A wondrous mystery indeed. 2 fresh yarns in the Pravda illustrate the irony beautifully. In the first, which we've linked to before, our brave reporter is positively amused to find a native tribe so benighted that they may imagine they'd be better off without democracy. In the second, our fearless correspondent is shocked that, in the darkest North America, the savages are so backward and credulous as to entertain the preposterous belief that counting heads amidst the mob is a sensible way to select responsible public officials. Let's probe a little deeper into this mystery. If the actions of our democratic governments are not to be ascribed to the venal machinations of politicians, who is responsible for them? Who, in the ideal apolitical, nonpartisan, or post-partisan state, calls the shots? We are back to the basic question of power, which Lenin once summarized as who, whom. This made more sense in English when we still used the word whom. What Lenin meant was who rules whom. So, if politicians should not rule, who, dear progressive, should? If we continue our pattern of two-word answers, the answer is public policy. To the progressive, rather ironically considering the history, Lenin's question is completely inappropriate. You reject the idea that government means that who must rule whom. Rather, you believe that government, when conducted properly in the public interest, is an objective discipline, like physics or geology or mathematics. It does not matter who the physicists, geologists, or mathematicians are. There is no German physics, liberal geology, or Catholic mathematics. There is only correct physics, correct geology, and correct mathematics. The process and criteria by which physicists separate correct from incorrect physics is quite different from that for geology or mathematics, and none of these processes is perfect or works instantaneously. But all have an obvious tendency to progress from error and ignorance to truth and knowledge. Needless to say, if the United States were blessed with a Department of Mathematics, honestly, I'm not sure why it isn't, but we can rest assured that if this wrong is ever righted, it will stay righted. It would be thoroughly inappropriate and irresponsible for George W. Bush to politicize the department's deliberations on topology, computability, game theory, etc. Public policy, of course, must not contradict physics, geology, or mathematics, but these are not its main linchpins. When we look inside the magic box of public policy, we see fields such as law and economics, and ethics, and sociology, and psychology, and public health, and foreign policy, and journalism, and education, and when we look at the history of these fields, we tend to see one of two things. Either A, the field was more or less invented in the 20th century, sociology, psychology, or B, its 20th century principles bear very little relation to those of its 19th century predecessor, law, economics. We saw this in Chapter 5, for example, with international law, but again, I am getting ahead of myself. As a progressive, you regard the fields of public policy as more or less scientific. The 20th century is the century of scientific public policy. And just as there is no German physics or Catholic mathematics, there is no German public policy or Catholic public policy. There is only public policy. There is no who. There is no rule. There is no world domination. There is only global governance. So we see why it's inappropriate for George W. Bush to politicize the Justice Department. It is because the Justice Department is staffed with legal scholars. Is George W. Bush a legal scholar? Is a boar hog an F-16? When politics intrudes on the realm of science, it's more than just a violation. It's a kind of rape. One is instantly reminded of the Nazi stormtroopers dancing around their flaming piles of books. One, if one is an American, is also reminded of the mindless jockery that ruled one's high school years. Do you, dear progressive, have any hesitation about picking a side in this dispute? Of course not. Thus, we see the fate of representative political democracy, which survives as a sort of vestigial reptile brain or fetal gill slit in the era of scientific government. In classic Machiavellian style, the form democracy has been redefined. It no longer means that the public's elected representatives control the government. It means that the government implements scientific public policy in the public interest. Public policy is in the public interest by definition. We may summarize the whole in Lincoln's concise paragraph, government of the people, by the people, for the people. All governments are of the people. They also provide animal control. The people being that they are, by the people turns out to be a bad idea, but we can still have government for the people, which gives us 2 out of the 3. which ain't bad. Since it is both of the people and for the people, and demos, after all, just means people, we can keep the good old word for our modern scientific democracy. You may already know all this, but perhaps it's worth a brief tour of how this system evolved. The basically criminal nature of the old political form of democracy has been discovered and rediscovered many times in American, and before that, of course, British, history. In his American Creation, the popular historian Joseph Ellis summarizes the founders' judgment on democracy, an alien, parasitic force. This, of course, would be their judgment as of the 1790s, not the 1770s, at which point they had had plenty of experience with said parasitic force. Any pre-modern history of the period, I recommend Albert Beveridge's 4-volume Life of John Marshall, will show you why. There is a reason you didn't learn much about the First Republic in the 11th grade civics class. The Second Republic, or constitutional period, saw a return to government by enlightened aristocrats, first under the Federalists and later under the Jeffersonians, who rather cleverly rode a wave of mob agitation into office and then ruled in a distinctly Federalist style, a trick that would later be repeated. This era of good feelings lasted until the election of politician Andrew Jackson, who, among other works of genius, invented the spoils system, the unabashed selection of political loyalists for government jobs. The following period of political turmoil, while distinguished by occasional flashes of sanity, such as the best system of government finance in history, and ameliorated by gridlock between North and South, which preserved a remarkably small and simple Washington, degenerated into the mass military insanity of the 1860s. Many Northern intellectuals, such as Henry Adams, had assumed that the defeat of the slave power would heal all the woes of the federal city and transform it into the shining light it was meant to be. Au contraire. Instead, in the Union period, or Third Republic, what was by 20th century standards a remarkably limited government, but by 18th century standards an almost omnipotent one, fell into the hands of ethnic machines, corrupt politicians, quasi-criminal financiers, sinister wire pullers, unscrupulous journalists, vested interests, and the like. History, which of course is always on the side of the winners, has written this down as the Gilded Age. For all its faults, the Gilded Age system created perhaps the most responsible and effective government in U.S. history. Architecture is always a good clue to the nature of power, and Gilded Age buildings, where they still stand, are invariably decorative. The country's prosperity and productivity was, of course, unmatched. Its laws were strict and strictly enforced. Nothing like today's festering ulcers of crime were imaginable. An English journalist of Tory bent, G.W. Stevens, wrote an excellent travelogue of Gilded Age America, the land of the dollar. It's very readable, especially if you don't mind the N-word. Stevens, in 1898, was unable to locate anything like a slum in New York City, and his intentions were not complimentary. It's an interesting exercise to compare the hyperventilations of a Gilded Age social reformer like Jacob Riis, the title How the Other Half Lives may ring a bell, to the world of Sudhir Venkatesh. Riis's tenement dwellers are sometimes less than well scrubbed. They can be slovenly. They drink a lot of beer. Their apartments are small and have poor ventilation. Ventilation, for some reason, seems to be a major concern. All these horrors still afflict the present-day residents of the Lower East Side, who are hardly in need of anyone's charity. But the Gilded Age political system was, again, criminal. In other words, it was democratic. The old American system is probably best compared to the government of China today. While they evolved from very different origins, they have converged in that universal medium, corruption. Government serves as a profit center, but, unlike neo-cameralism, the distribution of profits is informal. The dividends are fought over with 1,000 non-transparent stratagems. Since China is not a democracy, vote buying is not practiced there. It was certainly practiced here. And the bosses and plutocrats were not, by and large, cultured men. Sometimes I feel this is the main objection of their enemies. The American intellectual aristocracy simply could not tolerate a world in which their country was governed by these corrupt, boorish thugs. So, as aristocrats will, they plotted their revenge. I mentioned reform earlier, and Machiavelli, if you scroll back up to the top, uses the same word. Of course, he simply meant change the form of. He implied no connotations, but notice, dear progressive, your associations with the word reform. Like nonpartisan and all those other good words, it is connected with the happy part of your brain. Lowick's reform page is not bad. Politically, the deepest roots of the present regime are found in the liberal Republicans and the mugwumps of the early Union period. The cause they are most associated with is civil service reform, which removed the president's power to staff the civil service and replace it with competitive examinations, which tended to select, of course, scions of said aristocracy. Lowick has many other discussions of early progressivism, the settlement movement, the Fabians, and muckrakers. You were probably exposed to large doses of this in your 11th grade civics class. If you are still in 11th grade civics class, take an extra hit for this material. You'll need it. It is interesting to go back and read, say, Lincoln Steffens today. Unfortunately, Google Books has failed us on his Shame of the Cities, but here is a sample. And Steffens' autobiography, really a series of rants drawn loosely from his life, is easily obtainable. What comes through is, most of all, a tremendous sense of smugness and arrogance. Steffens, for example, will be talking to Teddy Roosevelt, a close personal friend, but the Prez doesn't always take Steffens' advice. He compromises sometimes. That's because he's weak, or ignorant, or corrupt, or maybe all three. Steffens' tone only works if you think of him as the underdog, but underdogs are infrequently found in the Oval Office, and hindsight indeed shows us that this underdog won, which makes him the overdog. And while its long-departed ghost is easily recognizable in the rhetoric of, say, Michael Moore, a brief glance at Steffens' work will show you that nothing like the political tradition he is attacking exists in the world today. To the extent that there are ethnic political machines, they are firmly in the hands of Steffens' successors. Whereas Steffens' tradition has flourished. He was the mentor, for example, of Walter Lippmann. If you traced the social network of modern journalism, all the lines would go back to Steffens and his cronies. And the lines lead overseas as well. Steffens went to Russia in 1919, and he loved it. As he wrote in 1930, quote, Soviet Russia was a revolutionary government with an evolutionary plan. Their plan was not by direct action to resist such evils as poverty and riches, graft, privilege, tyranny, and war, but to seek out and remove the causes of them. They were, at present, only laying a basis for these good things. They had to set up a dictatorship, supported by a small, trained minority, to make and maintain for a few generations a scientific rearrangement of economic forces, which would result in economic democracy first and political democracy last. Unquote. Economic democracy. Contemplate this concept, dear reader. Whatever economic democracy may be, it certainly has nothing at all to do with the practice of entrusting control of the state to elected representatives. Steffens then allows Lenin, whom he is interviewing, to deliver a few paragraphs on the necessity of murdering the bourgeoisie, and finally delivers his famous line. Quote, So you've been over into Russia? Asked Bernard Baruch. And I answered very literally, I have been over into the future, and it works. This was in Joe Davidson's studio, where Mr. Baruch was setting for a portrait bust. The sculptor asked if I wasn't glad to get back. I was. It was a mental change we had experienced, not physical. Bullitt asked in surprise why it was that, having been so elated by the prospect of Russia, we were glad to be back in Paris. I thought it was because, though we had been in heaven, we were so accustomed to our own civilization that we preferred hell. We were ruined. We could recognize salvation, but could not be saved. Unquote. Indeed, what Steffens calls applied Christianity, and you, our readers, will recognize as our good old friend creeping Quakerism, is seldom far behind the surface in his work. I think you get the drift, but let us summarize. Note that propaganda is not yet a term of abuse in 1930. Quote, In Russia, the ultimate purpose of this conscious process of merging politics and business is to abolish the political state as soon as its sole uses are served, to make defensive war abroad and at home, and to teach the people by propaganda and by enforced conditions to substitute new for old ideas and habits. The political establishment is a sort of protective scaffolding within which the temporary dictatorship is building all agriculture, all industries, and all businesses into one huge centralized organization. They will point out to you from over there that our businesses, too, are and long have been coming together, merging trusts into combines, which in turn unite into greater and greater monopolies. They think that when we Western reformers and liberals resist this tendency, we are standing in the way of natural, inevitable economic compulsion to form one big union of businesses. All that they have changed is the ownership, which they, and Henry Ford, think is about all that's wrong. Aren't they right to encourage the process? Aren't we wrong to oppose it? Unquote. Note this recycling of ideas through Russia. There is nothing Russian at all about the dream. Steffens is purveying. It is all in Edward Bellamy. From one day, a substantial and influential section of the American intelligentsia were the patrons, intellectual and political, of the Soviet Union, which spent all 80 years of its life manually trying to implement Bellamy's vision. Imagine how, say, libertarians would react if Russia decided to turn itself into a libertarian utopia. Imagine how easily they might come to overlook the matter if achieving the libertarian utopia turned out to involve, just a little bit of good old Russian-style killing. In self-defense, of course. Libertarians believe in self-defense, don't they? And besides, we're just killing government officials, and so on. Your understanding of the bond between the American aristocracy and the Soviets has been distorted by both right and left. The left has done everything possible to bury their complicity in the monstrous crimes of their Slavic epigones. The right has assisted them by misrepresenting the structure of this complicity, which was never, even in such clear-cut cases as Alger Hiss, a simple matter of treason. The American side was always the senior partner in the marriage. The prestige of their distinguished Western patrons was a key ingredient to the Soviet formula for legitimacy and internal control, and the growling staleness of the alliance contributed far more, I think, to the Soviet collapse than most today admit. Anyway, let's briefly finish up our origin myth, which ends, of course, in 1933. An excellent history of the period is supplied by the historian and progressive James Truslow Adams, who followed his 4-volume March of Democracy with 2 volumes of yearbooks written every year and not, so far as I could determine, edited afterwards, covering each year to 1948. This provides a pleasant, hindsightless feel found in few other treatments of the period. In his history of 1933, Adams reports, quote, "Nothing much was known about Roosevelt except his smile. As William Allen White wrote at the time of his inauguration, we are putting our hands in a grab bag. Heaven only knows what we shall pull out." With the disingenuousness apparently required of the presidential candidate, his campaign speeches had not disclosed his real views. Unquote. Well, that's putting it mildly. In fact, they had disclosed other views, which were not his real views, as Mariner Eccles put it. Quote, "Given later developments, the campaign speeches often read like a giant misprint, in which Roosevelt and Hoover speak each other's lines." Unquote. Apparently, White, for some reason, knew the story behind the script. Of course, if you don't believe in democracy, there is no reason not to treat it with contempt. Adams, with only a mild glaze of sycophancy, reports the result. Quote, "FDR was, in fact, with the help of what he considered the best expert advice, although always making final decision himself, trying experiments, and occasionally he frankly said so. In these experiments, he has been motivated by 2 objects. One, the overcoming of the Depression, and the other, the making over of the economic organization of the nation, the latter being what he called in his campaign speeches, the New Deal. It is this which appears, it is too soon to speak positively, his chief objective, and it is difficult as yet to judge what his conception of the new society may be. In his first year he has shown enormous courage, but has, apparently, not seldom changed his point of view, as well as his advisers. As the latter loomed large in the administration, to a considerable extent displacing the regular cabinet in public sight, the so-called brain trust requires some comment. Of recent years, college professors have been more and more frequently called into consultation as experts. Hoover made frequent application to them when president. Roosevelt did the same as governor of New York, and foreign governments have done likewise. However, they have never been so in the forefront of affairs as since Roosevelt entered the White House, and this, together with the vagueness of what the New Deal might signify, helped to hinder the restoration of confidence. The lack of ability to foresee the future, to say nothing in too many cases of the absence of personal integrity, has indeed thrown the big businessmen, the bankers and the captains of industry, into the discard. But on the other hand, the American has never had much belief in the practical ability of a professor, and the experts have disagreed among themselves as notably as doctors are said to do. Moreover, Roosevelt chose many of his advisers from the distinct radical or left-wing group, the names of most of them being utterly new to the public. At first among the chief of these appear to have been Professor Raymond Moley, Dr. R.G. Tugwell, and A.A. Barrell, Jr., all of Columbia University, New York. In the summer of 1933, there were added to these and many others Professor G.F. Warren of Cornell, a leading advocate of the community dollar, and Professor J.H. Rogers of Yale. At least 20 or 30 others could be mentioned. It is to the Brain Trust that we owe the carrying out of the vague New Deal, or as a great admirer of the president prefers to call it, the Roosevelt Revolution. What the final result may be, no one can say yet, but as we shall see at the end of the chapter, they have presented a staggering bill for the American citizens to pay." Unquote. Indeed, I doubt there is a more succinct history of the birth of public policy. I date the Fourth Republic and the Progressive period to 1933. We can read this story in two ways. We can read it as the coming of modern scientific government in the United States, or we can read it as the transfer of power from political democracy to the American university system, which, just for the sake of a catchy catchword, I like to say the cathedral. Albert J. Nock had no doubts on the matter. Allow me to reproduce a section of his diary from 1933. Quote, 29 October. "And so Brother Hitler decides he will no longer play with the League of Nations. This leaves the League in rather a shattered state, as Artemus Ward said of the Confederate Army after Lee's surrender. That army now consists of Kirby Smith, 4 mules, and a brass drum, and is moving rapidly toward Texas." 30 October. "Public doings in this country are beyond all comment. Roosevelt has assembled in Washington the most extraordinary aggregation of quacks, I imagine, that has ever been herded together. This passage from the scene of political action will remove the most lively showman that has ever been seen in America since the death of P.T. Barnum. The absence of opposition is remarkable. Republicans seem to have forgotten that the function of an opposition is to oppose. I say this in derision, of course, for our politics are always bipartisan. I have talked with many people. No one has any confidence in Roosevelt's notions, but the organs of public opinion either praise him or are silent, and no one expects that Congress will call him on the carpet. The only certain things are that his fireworks will cost a lot of money, and that they will enlarge our bureaucracy indefinitely. Most of the big federal slush funds that the taxpayers will create next year will go to local politicians, nominally for improvements, unemployment, or whatnot, but actually for an increase of jobs and jobbery. This ought to build up a very strong machine for the next campaign, as I am convinced it is meant to do, and all it is meant to do, and no doubt it will. I notice that the new move of juggling with the price of gold has been turned over to the RFC instead of to the Treasury, thus making the RFC a personal agent of the President. 31 October. To my mind, there was never a better example of getting up a scare in order, as Mr. Jefferson said, to waste the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. Our improvement, such as it is, was underway in June, and there is no evidence whatever that Mr. Roosevelt's meddling has accelerated it. One is reminded of the headlong haste about farming the federal Constitution, on the pretext that the country was going to the dogs under the Articles of Confederation, when in fact it was doing very well indeed, as recent researches have shown. All this is a despicable trick. The papers say that in this business of meddling with the gold market, Roosevelt is influenced by the theorists of Irving Fisher. It reminds me that when I was in Europe, I heard that one of Hitler's principal lieutenants is a chap that I used to know pretty well. The only name I can think of is Helfschlager, and that is not right. His family are the art dealers in Munich, Hanfstaengl. That's it. I got well acquainted with him in New York, and saw him afterward in Munich, and came away with the considered belief that he is a fine fellow and uncommonly likable, but just as crazy as a loon. I have long had precisely that opinion of Fisher. Therefore, if it is true that Irving Fisher is to the front in America as Hofschlager in Germany, I think the future for both countries looks pretty dark." Unquote. Don't miss Lewick on Irving Fisher. The page demonstrates the dichotomy perfectly. So, as so often here on UR, we have two ways to see reality. Either power has passed into the hands of the cathedral, or it has disappeared and been replaced by mere science, public policy. Of course, you know what I think, but what do you think? If we can conceive the cathedral as an actual, non-divinely inspired political machine for a movement, suspending any resentment or reverence we may feel toward it, not assuming that the policies it produces are good or bad, or true or false, we can just admire it from an engineering perspective and see how well it works. First, if there is one pattern we see in the public policies the cathedral produces, it's that they tend to be very good at creating dependency. We can observe the dependency system by imagining what would happen if Washington, D.C., out to the radius of the Beltway, is suddenly teleported by aliens into a different dimension, where its residents will live out their lives in unimaginable wealth, comfort, and personal fulfillment. We here on Earth, however, see the federal city disappear in a flash of light, in its place a crater of radioactive glass. What would happen? Many, many checks would no longer arrive. Children would go hungry, not just in North America, but around the world. Old people would starve. Babies would die of easily preventable diseases. Hurricane victims would squat in squalor in the slums. Drug companies would sell poison. Stockbrokers would sell worthless paper. Toys R Us would sell little plastic parts designed to stick in my daughter's throat and choke her, etc., etc. Washington has made itself necessary, not just to Americans, but to the entire world. Why does Washington want to help the survivors of Cyclone Nargis? Because helping is what it does. It dispenses love to all. Its mission is quite simply to do good on a planetary basis. And why does the government of Burma want to stop it? Why turn down free help, including plenty of free stuff, and possibly even some free money? Because dependency is another name for power. The relationship between dependent and provider is the relationship between client and patron, which is the relationship between parent and child, which also happens to be the relationship between master and slave. There's a reason Aristotle devotes the first book of Politics to this sort of kitchen government. Modern Americans have enormous difficulty in grasping hierarchical social structures. We grew up steeped in applied Christianity pretty much the same way the Hitler Youth grew up steeped in Hitler. Suggesting that slavery could ever be or have been, as Aristotle suggests, natural and healthy, is like suggesting to the Hitler Youth that it might be cool to make some Jewish friends. Their idea of Jews is straight out of the Ute-Sice. Our idea of slavery is straight out of Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you want an accurate perspective of the past, a propaganda novel is probably not the best place to start. If you want an accurate perspective of American slavery, I recommend Eugene Genovese's Roll, Jordan, Roll, which is a little Marxist, but only superficially so. No work like it could be written today. Legally and socially, a slave is an adult child. There's a reason the word emancipation is used for the dissolution of both bonds. We think of the master-slave relationship as usually sick and twisted, and invariably adversarial. Parent-child relationships can be all three, but they are not normally so. If history, not to mention evolutionary biology, proves anything, it proves that humans fit into dominant-submission structures almost as easily as they fit into the nuclear family. Slavery is an extreme, but the general pattern is that the patron owes the client protection and subsistence, while the client owes the patron loyalty and service. The patron is liable to the public for the actions of the client. If they offend, he must make amends. In return, he has the right, indeed the obligation, to regulate and discipline his clients. He is a private provider of government. Thus, Aristotle. Slavery is government on the micro scale. Heed the Greek, dude. So comparing the social paternalism of Washington to the classical relationship between master and slave is not at all far-fetched, or even particularly pejorative. And if it is pejorative, it is because the 20th century imitation often seems to resemble less a functional paternal bond than a dysfunctional one. Less parent-child than parent-teenager. With many of Washington's clients, foreign and domestic, there is plenty of substance and even protection, but precious little loyalty, service, discipline, or responsibility. We are now in a position to understand the relationship between Washington and Rangoon. Rangoon, I refuse to call it Yangon. The idea that a government can change the name of a city or a country is a distinctly 20th century one, refuses to accept the assistance of the international community because it does not want to become a client. You'll find that any sentence can be improved by replacing the phrase international community with State Department. State does not impose many obligations on its clients, but one of them is that you can't be a military government, at least not unless you're a left-wing military government with friends at Harvard. The roots of the present Burmese regime are basically National Socialist, i.e., no friends at Harvard. Burma cannot go directly from being an enemy to being a rebellious teenager. It would have to go through the helpless child stage first, and that means the end of the generals. One reason the Jonah Goldbergs of the world have such trouble telling their right from their left is that they expect some morphological feature of the state to answer the question for them. For anyone other than Goldberg, Stalin was on the left and Hitler was on the right. The difference is not a function of discrepancies in administrative procedure between the KZs and the Gulag. It's a function of social networks. Stalin was a real socialist. Hitler was a fake one. Stalin was part of the international socialist movement. Hitler wasn't, but I digress. What specifically will happen if Burma admits an army of aid workers? What will happen is that they'll make friends in Burma. Their friends will not be the people in power. Not quite, but they will probably be close to it. Thus the ties between the international community and all kinds of alternatives to the generals will be strengthened. Since the latter's position is already precarious at best, much better if a few of the victims have to eat mud for a month or two. They will fend for themselves in the end. People do. And why is Washington playing this game? Just because it does. In that golden city are armies of desks, each occupied by a dedicated public servant whom the cathedral has certified to practice public policy, whose job it is to care about Burma. And he or she does. That's what Washington does. As George H.W. Bush put it, message, I care. When our patron's suffering clients are actually American citizens, this pattern, as Knock predicted correctly, generates votes. Before the New Deal, vote buying in America was generally local and informal. Retail, you might say. After 1933, it was wholesale. But however much of a client it becomes, I really can't imagine the generals can hold out that much longer. Burma will never export electoral votes. Statehood is unimaginable. So why does Washington continue to molest the generals in pursuit of the love and fealty of the Burmese people? Just because it does. There is adaptive value in applied Christianity. That adaptive value derives from its domestic application. There is little or no adaptive value in restricting the principle to domestic clients, and it involves a level of conscious cynicism which is not compatible with the reality of progressivism, so the restriction does not evolve. Thus, the Neo-Quakerism, which supplies the ethical core of progressivism and is evangelized with increasingly relentless zeal by the cathedral's robeless monks, is completely compatible with the acquisition and maintenance of political power. Not only does the design work, I find it hard to imagine how it could work any better, which does not mean that applied Christianity is evil, that the Burmese generals are good, or that their suffering subjects would not be better off understanding Washington's friendly umbrella. Second, let's observe the relationship between the cathedral and our old friend, democracy. Since 1933, elected politicians have exercised minimal actual control over government policy. Formally, however, they have absolute control. The cathedral is not mentioned in the Constitution. Power is a juicy caterpillar. Maybe it looks like a twig to most of us birds, but Washington has no shortage of sharp eyes, sharp beaks, and growling bellies. We can see the answer when we look at the fate of politicians who have attacked the cathedral. Here are some names: Joseph McCarthy, Enoch Powell, George Wallace, Spiro Agnew. Here are some others: Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Margaret Thatcher. The first set are politicians whose break with the cathedral was complete and unconditional. The second are politicians who attempted to compromise and coexist with it, while pulling it in directions it did not want to go. The first were destroyed. The second appeared to succeed, for a while. But little trace of their efforts, at least in domestic policy, is visible today. Their era ends in the 1980s, and it is impossible to imagine similar figures today. What we see, especially in the cases of McCarthy and Powell, the recent BBC documentary on Powell is quite good, is a tremendous initial burst of popularity, trailing off into obloquy and disrepute. At first, these politicians were able to capture large bases of support. At least 70% of the British electorate was on Powell's side. This figure may even be low. But Powell, Radio Enoch aside, never had the tools to preserve these numbers and convert them into power. Similar majorities of American voters today will tell pollsters that they support Powellian policies, ending immigration, deporting illegals, terminating the racial spoils system. These majorities are stable. No respectable politician will touch them. Why? Because they cannot afford to antagonize the cathedral, whose policies are the opposite. Recall Lowick's simple summary of the Lippmann system. Quote, "The decision-makers then take decisions and use the art of persuasion to inform the public about the decisions and the circumstances surrounding them." Unquote. Of course, all politicians in all Western countries depend on the official press to promote and legitimize their campaigns. Powell and McCarthy had no direct channels of communication with the Powellists and McCarthyists. They had to rely on the BBC and on ABC, NBC, and CBS, respectively. It's rather as if the U.S. attempted to invade the Third Reich by booking passage for its soldiers on the Imperial Japanese Navy. The OP, known to most bloggers as the MSM, is part of the civil service complex around the cathedral. Call it the Polygon. An institution is in the Polygon if it defers to the cathedral on all disputable questions. Because to a devotee of the cathedral, its perspectives are beyond question. No two devotees can disagree on any serious matter, unless, of course, both sides of the disagreement are represented in the cathedral itself. And the cathedral is not exactly noted for disagreeing with itself, at least not from an external perspective. You will not see the Times attacking Harvard, for example, or the State Department. They all have the same ant smell, as it were. The Times is not formally a government institution, as the BBC is, but it might as well be. If American journalism were coordinated into a Department of Information, as it was in World War I and World War II, the journalists were granted GS ranks. Very little in their lives would change. As civil servants, they would be exactly as immune to political pressure as they are at present, and they would have exactly the same access to government secrets that they have at present. The cathedral's response to these dissident politicians thus took two forms, one fast and one slow. Both would have been effective. Together, they were devastating. First, the art of persuasion, more dramatically known as psychological warfare, convinced their supporters that the politicians themselves were sick, awful, and weird, and so, by extension, was anyone who followed them. Second, the cathedral itself adapted to the doctrines of Powell and McCarthy by making opposition to them an explicit tenet of the faith. Since the cathedral educates the world's most fashionable people, and since it holds power, and power is always fashionable, cathedralism is fashionable more or less by definition. Of course, if you were fashionable, you knew instantly that Powell and McCarthy were on the slow boat to nowhere. But the unfashionable are always the majority, and they are not unfashionable because they choose to be. They are unfashionable because they can't pull off fashionable. As it became clear to all that Powell and McCarthy were not done, their fans disappeared. Their bases of support had been a mile wide and an inch deep. Their attacks on the cathedral were pathetic and doomed, like taking on the Death Star with a laser pointer. Personally, both men were mercurial and unstable. Powell was a genius, the last real statesman in British politics, while McCarthy was an old-school, hard-drinking politician with Roy Cohn on his team, and it is no surprise that none of their colleagues emulated their suicidal bravado. As for the second class, the Thatchers and Nixons and Reagans, in terms of their own personal outcomes they were smarter. They attacked the cathedral not across the board, but on single issues on which their support was overwhelming. Sometimes they actually prevailed. for a while on these points. Reagan got his military buildup, Thatcher got deregulation, Nixon defeated North Vietnam. Of course, the Nixon administration also created the EPA, initiated the racial spoils system, and imposed wage and price controls. Thatcher got Britain inextricably into the EU, and so on. These semi-outsider politicians provide a valuable service to the cathedral. While opposing a few of its policies, they validate all the others as a bipartisan consensus, which everyone decent is obligated to support. They thus do the heavy lifting of persuading their supporters, who probably wouldn't read the Times even if they did trust it, to change with the changing times. And the times are always changing. And we just can't not change with them, can we? To the extent that democratic politics still exists in the Western world, it exists in the form of the two-party system. The parties have various names, which they have inherited from history, but there are only two parties, the inner party and the outer party. It is never hard to tell which is which. The function of the inner party is to delegate all policies and decisions to the cathedral. The function of the outer party is to pretend to oppose the inner party, while in fact posing no danger at all to it. Sometimes outer party functionaries are even elected, and they may even succeed in pursuing a few of their deviant policies. The entire polygon will unite in ensuring that these policies either fail or are perceived by the public to fail. Since the official press is part of the polygon and has a more or less direct line into everyone's brain, this is not difficult. The outer party has never even come close to damaging any part of the polygon or cathedral. Even McCarthy was not a real threat. He got a few people fired, most temporarily. Most of them were actually Soviet agents of one sort or another. They became martyrs and have been celebrated ever since. His goal was a purge of the State Department. He didn't even come close. If he had somehow managed to fire every Soviet agent or sympathizer in the U.S. government, he would not even have done any damage. As Carol Quigley pointed out, McCarthy and his supporters thought he was attacking a nest of communist spies, whereas, in fact, he was attacking the American establishment. Don't bring a toothpick to a gunfight. McCarthy never even considered trying to abolish the State Department, let alone State, Harvard, the CFR, the Rockefeller Foundation, and every other institution in the same class. By my count, if you lump all his efforts together with the entire phenomena of McCarthyism, you get about 10 millihitlers. And not even Hitler, of course, succeeded in the end. An essential element in the art of persuasion is the systematic propagation of the exact opposite of this situation. Devotees of the inner party and the cathedral are deeply convinced that the outer party is about to fall on them and destroy them in a new fascist upheaval. They often believe that the outer party itself is the party of power. They can be easily terrified by poll results of the type that Powell, etc., demonstrated. There are all kinds of scary polls that can be conducted which, if they actually translated into actual election results in which the winners of the election had actual power, would seriously suck. That's democracy for you. But power in our society is not held by democratic politicians, nor should it be. Indeed, the intelligentsia are in a minority. Indeed, they live in a country that is a democracy. Indeed, in theory, their entire way of life hangs by a thread. But if you step back and look at history over any significant period, you only see them becoming stronger. It is their beliefs that spread to the rest of the world, not the other direction. When outer party supporters embrace stupid ideas, no one has any reason to worry, because the outer party will never win. When the inner party goes mad, it is time to fear. Madness and power are not a fresh cocktail. And thus we see the role of democracy in the progressive period. Strauss says, quote, "Democracy provides a pressure release valve for dissent. As long as the party in power are up for re-election in a period of months to single-digit years, opponents can grit their teeth and remind themselves that this too shall pass, and wait for an opportunity to vote the bums out. Democracies don't usually spawn violent opposition parties because opposition parties can hope to gain power through non-violent means." Unquote. This is the theory. But since elected politicians in the cathedral system have, as we've seen, no real power, what we're looking at here is not a pressure relief valve, but a fake pressure release valve. The regular exchange of parties in power reassures you, dear voter, that if the state starts to become seriously insane, the valve will trip, the bums will be thrown out, and everything will return to normal. In fact, we know exactly what Washington's policies 20 years from now will be. They will certainly have nothing to do with politics. They will be implementations of the ideas now taught at Harvard, Yale, and Berkeley. There is a little lag as the memes work their way through the system, as older and wiser civil servants retire and younger, more fanatical ones take their place, but this lag is getting shorter all the time, and by the standards of the average voter 40 years ago, let alone 80, Washington already is seriously insane. What is the probability that your standards, as progressive as they may be, Washington 40 years from now will not seem just as crazed? Fairly low, I'm afraid. And this brings us to the third point about the public policy apparatus. While appearing unconscious of its audience, it adapted to it. This is the most incriminating point, because there is no good explanation for it, and the trend is quite ominous if projected outwards. Take the recent decision of the California Supreme Court, who have just discovered that the state's constitution allows people of the same sex to marry. As a matter of policy, I have no objection to this. Quite the contrary. I think it's an excellent and sensible policy. I do, however, have an interest in where this policy came from. This is what, in the 20th century progressive public policy world, we call law. The craft of the lawyer used to be the craft of discovering how the words of a law were intended, by the officials who ratified the law, to imply that one's client was in the right. I think it's fairly safe to assume that the drafters and ratifiers of the California Constitution and its various amendments had no such understanding of their work. Try reading the actual decision. It's a fascinating hunk of boilerplate. Nonetheless, the drafters wrought better than they knew. The practice of drafting laws which are vague to the point of meaninglessness, then empowering judges to interpret them, is simply another way of abolishing politics. Congress legislates this way all the time. All they are doing is transferring the power of legislation to a more private body, which is not subject to public scrutiny and the other painful woes of politics. The great thing about the gay marriage decision is that no one in California has any idea who made it. I think there are 9 people on the California Supreme Court. Who are they? How did they get their jobs? Who the heck knows? No one seems to care at all. The U.S. Constitution was the first and greatest offender in this department. Its drafters did not even agree on such basic matters as whether a state could leave the Union. In practice, it made the Supreme Court the supreme legislative assembly, which, over the last 200 years, mostly over the last 50, has created a body of decisions perfectly comparable to Britain's unwritten constitution that we call constitutional law. The idea that this legislative corpus can be derived in some mystical yet automatic way from the text of the Constitution is preposterous, and no one holds it. Instead, we have the living Constitution, which always seems to live to the left. I've never heard anyone, not even the most deranged fundamentalist, propose reinterpreting the Constitution to provide rights to fetuses. An obvious corollary of this approach, if the inner party and the outer party were symmetric opposites and the life of the Constitution was powered by political democracy. Of course, it is not. It does not rest in formal interpretations of texts. It rests in ethical judgments. It is the job of the legislature to make the ethical judgments, and the California Supreme Court is doing its job. It's a pity it has to carpool with such a large bodyguard of lies, but that's the modern world for you. And we know where these ethical judgments come from. They are inter-party judgments, and the inner party's ethics are Christian, Protestant, and Quaker in their origins. Fine. We all need ethics, and applied Christianity will do as well as anything else. What interests me is when these ethical judgments come about. Imagine, for instance, that the California Supreme Court had decided in, say, 1978 that it was unethical, unconstitutional, for California to prohibit its male citizens from marrying each other. Is this a thinkable event? I think not. And yet the court's writ ran just as far and was just as powerful in 1978 as in 2008, and ethics, surely, have not changed. The living Constitution does not adapt with changes in ethics. It adapts with changes in public opinion, as long as that public opinion is shifting in the direction of applied Christianity. Public opinion was ready for abortion in 1973. Barely. It was ready for gay marriage in 2008. Barely. It was not ready for gay marriage in 1973. What will it be ready for in 2033? One can see this as a noble concession to the great principle of democracy. One can also see it as the cathedral getting away with whatever it can get away with, and nothing else. Larry Auster, probably the most imaginative and interesting right-wing writer on the planet, who also happens to be a converted fundamentalist Christian, with all the theological baggage that you, dear open-minded progressive, would expect from such a person, has a good term for this: the unprincipled exception. Briefly, an unprincipled exception is a policy that violates some absolute principle of ethics held by the policymaker, but is not openly acknowledged as such a violation. For example, dear progressive, why is racism wrong? Racism is wrong because all humans are born simply as humans, having done nothing right or wrong, and it is incompatible with our deeply held ethical principles to mark these newborn babies with indelible labels which assign them either privileges or penalties which they have not earned, such as the privilege of being able to drink at sparkling clean water fountains marked whites only, or the penalty of having to go out back to the horse trough. We hit that one out of the park, didn't we? Okay, so why is it ethical to label newborn babies as American or Mexican due to nothing but the descent and geographical position at birth of their parents, and give the former a cornucopia of benefits for which the latter is barred, such as the right to live, work, and drink from drinking fountains in the continental United States? What makes Washington think it's somehow ethical to establish two classes of human, Americans and Mexicans, based only on coincidences of birth that are just as arbitrary as black versus white, and treat the two completely differently? How does this differ from racism, Southern style? You think this is ugly? Oh, we can get worse. Let's suppose the U.S., in its eagerness to treat these second-class humans, if not quite as well as possible, at least better than we treat them now, establishes a new guest worker program, which is open only to Nigerians. Any number of Nigerians may come to the U.S. and work. There are certain restrictions, however. They have to live in a special guest worker housing. They have to go to their workplace in the morning and return before the sun sets. They may not wander around the streets at night. They must carry special guest worker passes. Obviously, they can't vote, and they are strictly prohibited from using all public amenities, including, of course, drinking fountains. Is it a more ethical policy to have this program or not to have it? If you think no Nigerians could be found to take advantage of it, you're quite wrong. If you have the program, should you cancel it and send the Nigerians home to a life of continued poverty back in Nigeria? How is this helping them? On the other hand, our program has all the major features of apartheid, and surely no apartheid is better than apartheid. There is a very easy resolution to this problem. Adopt the principle that no person is illegal. This rule is perfectly consistent with applied Christianity. It is taught at all our great universities. It is implied every time a journalist deploys the euphemism undocumented. And I'm sure there are dozens of ways in which it can be incorporated into our great living Constitution. There is only one problem. The people are not quite ready for it. But perhaps in 30 years they will be. Perhaps. I would bet money on it. And I would also bet that, by the time this principle is established, denying it will be the equivalent of racism. Us old fogies who were born in the 1970s will be convulsed with guilt and shame at the thought that the U.S. actually considered it ethically acceptable to turn away, deport, and otherwise penalize our fellow human beings on the ridiculous and irrelevant grounds that they were born somewhere else. So the cathedral wins coming and going. Today, it does not suffer the political backlash that would be sure to ensue if the political party endorsed open borders to everyone. Still less if it actually did so, unless it let the new Americans vote as soon as they set foot on our sacred soil, which, of course, would be the most Christian approach. In 2038, having increased North America's population to approximately 2 billion persons, none of them illegal, and all living in the same third world conditions, which it has already inflicted on most of the planet, our blessed cathedral will have the privilege of berating the past with its guilt for not recognizing the obvious truth that no person is illegal. Ain't it beautiful? It is, but I have been talking about this cathedral thing for long enough that I'm not sure you believe it really exists. Well, do I have a treat for you. It's not news that I believe the cathedral is evil, and since it's 2008, you'd expect evil to not only have a name, but a blog. And sure enough, it does. Evil's name is Timothy Burke. He is a professor of history, specializing in southern Africa, at Swarthmore, and his blog is easily distracted. The great thing about Professor Burke is that he appears to have a conscience. Almost every post in his blog can be understood as a kind of rhetorical struggle to repress some inner pang of doubt. He is the good German par excellence. When people of this mindset found themselves in the Third Reich, they were moderate Nazis. In Czechoslovakia or Poland, they worked within the system. Professor Burke is nowhere near being a dissident, but there is a dissident inside of him. He doesn't like it. Not at all. He stabs it with his steely knives. He can check out any time, but he can never leave. His position is a high one, and not easy to get. The entire blog is characterized, indeed it could serve as a type specimen for, the quality that Nabokov called Poshlost. Simply an embarrassment of riches. I am saddened by the fact that, as a new parent, I cannot devour the whole thing, but as a case study, I have selected this. The whole post is a treat, but I am especially tickled by the line, quote, I am drawn to procedural liberalism because I live in worlds that are highly procedural, and my skills and training are adapted to manipulating procedural outcomes. Unquote. Manipulating procedural outcomes? My entire post, maybe even my entire blog, reduced to 3 words. If you want to know how you are governed, this is it. You are governed by manipulating procedural outcomes. It's perfect. It belongs on someone's tomb. But don't even click on the link if you are not prepared to work up a little steam. Barack Obama's handling of his grandmother was brutal, perhaps, but it really has nothing on the job Professor Burke does on his mother-in-law. Quote, when I talk to my mother-in-law, I often get a clear view of its workings, and the role that mass culture, including the mainstream media, play in providing fresh narrative hooks and telling incidentals to its churnings. In the last 2 years, for example, every time I talk to her, she wants to return to the story of Ward Churchill, or she wants to talk about how terrible crime is, or about the problem of illegal immigrants, and so on. These are immobile, self-reproducing stories. Their truth in her mind is guaranteed by something far outside the actualities and realities that compose any given incident or issue. Unquote. These are immobile, self-reproducing stories. I desperately want his mother-in-law to find this post, read it, and slap Professor Burke very hard across his overgrown 13-year-old face. But I doubt it'll happen. Their truth in her mind is guaranteed by something far outside the actualities and realities that compose any given incident or issue. Can even this awful sentence do justice to the twisted mind of Timothy Burke, to the cathedral as a whole, on which he is one small gargoyle on a minor, far-flung flying buttress? Dear open-minded progressive, I invite you to read this post, or anything else on Professor Burke's remarkably revealing blog, if you remain undecided, and ask yourself again, do I trust the cathedral? Do I consider it a source of responsible, effective public policy? And, in the long term, is it secure? In Chapter 8, we try to figure out what to do if the answer turns out to be no.